Good morning. This presentation is going to be about autoimmune disorders. So let's dive in. Autoimmune disorders represent chronic diseases, and they develop due to a combination of multiple genetic and environmental factors. At this point, we have identified over 80 different autoimmune disorders. They often have disabling symptoms. Some common symptoms that are across all of them include chronic pain, chronic inflammation, and fatigue. These people often also have feelings of anxiety or depression. And then the disorders also have a broad range of symptoms that overlap across different disorders. They become very complex and hard to diagnose. Incidence of autoimmune disorders is definitely increasing. Based on medical studies and research suggests that approximately 5 to 8% of the U.S. population is affected by at least one autoimmune disorder. This is roughly the same percentage of people who contract cancer or cardiovascular disease, which are the number 1 and 2 causes of death in the U.S. The National Institutes of Health actually estimates that over 23 million Americans, which would be closer to 20 to 25%, suffer from some type of autoimmune disorder. And then the AARD, which is the American Autoimmune Related Diseases Association, estimates that number closer to 50 million. So these disorders are important because they do have a significant economic impact with respect to healthcare costs and workplace productivity, and they also have a significant social impact. Risk factors. So individual genetic variants definitely play a role, and we're learning more and more about that with all the research and studies. Gender. Actually, more women than men tend to be affected by autoimmune disorders. And one of the reasons that we think this might be is because estrogen stimulates B cell growth, which is one of our immune type cells. It also stimulates antibody production and cytokine production. Those are all involved in the autoimmune response, and estrogen levels are much higher for women than men. So that's one thing that is being looked into. And then race seems to play a role. Black people are at higher risk for lupus and scleroderma, but lower risk for type 1 diabetes and MS. So it seems like our race definitely plays a role in not necessarily the ability or the susceptibility to get autoimmune disorders, but which autoimmune disorders. And then exposure to certain infectious agents like bacteria and viruses, exposure to mercury, smoking, and stress. Also, a person with one autoimmune disorder is at a higher risk of developing additional autoimmune disorders. So these disorders are characterized by an impaired immune response, which leads our immune system to attack our own tissues and organs. And those tissues and organs are going to vary depending on the disorder itself. So for type 1 diabetes, the pancreas and insulin-producing cells are affected. For lupus, it's our skin, joints, kidneys, and heart. Multiple sclerosis is a central nervous system disorder. RA, or rheumatoid arthritis, affects the joints, usually in the hands or the knees or ankles. And in RA, it'll be both sides. So the joints on both sides of the body will be affected. Fibromyalgia affects joints and connective tissue. Crohn's is an inflammatory bowel disorder that affects the GI tract. For Crohn's, it's particularly the end of the small bowel and the beginning of the colon. And then ulcerative colitis, also an IBD, also affecting the gastrointestinal tract, actually particularly looks at or affects the innermost lining of the colon, so different areas of the colon. Celiac disease affects the small intestine, specifically attacks the microvilli that line the intestine, which is how we absorb all of our nutrients. Graves' disease affects the thyroid gland, resulting in hyperthyroidism. Psoriasis, scleroderma, and dermatitis herpetiformis are all disorders affecting the skin. Sjogren's affects the joints and organs. Hashimoto's also affects the thyroid gland, but it results in hypothyroidism. Chronic Lyme disease affects nerves, eyes, and heart. Restless leg system, the signaling between the muscles and the legs. And then interstitial cystitis affects the bladder. So the immune system defends us from pathogens and toxins because it recognizes that these substances are foreign. Those are called antigens, and it produces a response that weakens and eliminates them. Autoreactive cells are immune cells that produce antibodies against the body's own cells, and we obviously want to minimize those. Some autoreactive immune cells will leak or reach circulation in almost everybody. One of the nice things about these cells is that because they are unique to a particular antigen, if we do tests and these autoantibodies appear, then that can help us to identify and diagnose the particular disease or disorder we're looking at. Our immune system has tolerances built in to prevent these autoreactive cells from becoming too high in volume or harming ourselves. Central tolerance is a process that eliminates these autoreactive cells before they ever mature or enter circulation. But as we said, some of them are going to leak out and reach circulation. So we also have peripheral tolerance, which controls these cells once they enter circulation to keep them from damaging our own tissues. And the way that we do that is that we emit certain chemical substances, defensive proteins that can help eliminate these cells or weaken them. So cytokines is one of those things. They're secreted by immune cells. They perform cell-to-cell communication, coordinating an immune response to antigens. An example of these include chemokines, interferons, interleukins, tumor necrosis factor, and colony-stimulating factors. Histamine, the bad guy in our allergies, is also one of these peripheral tolerance chemicals. It's a signaling chemical, also released by the immune system. And there are multiple types of histamine receptors. The H4 receptors seem to be most involved in autoimmune disease. They have a high affinity and specificity for mediator release. What that means, again, is based on the specific histamine we're looking at, we can kind of figure out what the target cell is and what the disorder might be. And then prostaglandins are lipids that act like hormones. We also have regulatory B cells, another type of immune system cell. They help to maintain tolerances and limit ongoing immune response and restore our systems to homeostasis. One characteristic that is very, very common in most people with an autoimmune disorder is called leaky gut. This occurs when the tight junctions of the gastrointestinal lining become loose and they allow undigested food, as well as toxins and pathogens, to escape the GI tract and enter the bloodstream. Toxins and pathogens, we have immune responses to try and trap them, but the more leaky your gut is, the more of these things that are going to get in your bloodstream, the harder your immune system's working, and it becomes difficult for it to keep up. And then undigested food particles can actually trigger immune responses because they can stick to certain tissues, making them look like they're foreign and causing the immune system to attack them. We don't know if leaky gut is a root cause, a contributing factor, or a symptom, but we do know that most people with autoimmune disorder also have leaky gut. Contributes to food sensitivities, which are very common in most autoimmune disorders. Symptoms can include abdominal pain and bloating, constipation and or diarrhea, acid reflux, migraine headaches, acne or eczema, chronic fatigue, anxiety or depression, mood swings, brain fog, joint pain, and muscle pain. One of the things that's really important to understand is the difference between a food allergy, a food sensitivity, and a food intolerance. A lot of times those terms are used interchangeably, and they are definitely different things. A food allergy, classified as a type 1 hypersensitivity, involves the production specifically of IgE antibodies. And the response is usually quick. Within an hour or two, if not immediate. So it's easier to identify the food or the ingredient that caused the reaction. And that reaction may be hives, it may be a rash, or it may be respiratory difficulties. Common food allergens, which are usually proteins, include casein, which is the protein in dairy, gluten, which is the protein in wheat, soy, chicken eggs, tree nuts, peanuts, shellfish, citrus, and yeast. Then a food sensitivity is an adverse response to a food or ingredient in a food. It triggers an inflammatory response. It may involve production of either IgM or IgG antibodies, and IgG are the most common. That's called a type 3 hypersensitivity. Or it triggers the release of mediators, which are some of those things that we talked about, like cytokines and histamine and prostaglandins. It'll trigger those mediators, which is called a type 4 hypersensitivity. The response is delayed, sometimes up to 72 hours, which makes identifying that trigger food or ingredient a lot more difficult. And the sensitivity level may be different. It may be severe, it may be moderate, it may be mild. And this complicates further identifying that ingredient, because you may have a mild or moderate sensitivity to something. You may eat that food and not have a response. But then you may eat it later, and let's say you combine it with another food that you have a mild or a moderate response to, and you do get a response. So it's just really, really tough. Keep in mind that the sensitivity, again, could be a response to the food itself or an environmental factor associated with the food. So it could be elements of an herbicide or a pesticide or a pollen that is on that food. And a food sensitivity can be developed to any type of food. Doesn't have to be a protein, doesn't have to be a sugar, doesn't have to be a chemical. It can be a banana or an avocado. It's crazy, right? Then a food intolerance is completely different from an allergy or a sensitivity, because there is no immune system response. A food intolerance occurs when we have digestive dysfunction or a lack of digestive capacity to break down a specific food component. So we don't have enough of an enzyme, or we don't have the enzyme at all to break something down. So common intolerances include dairy. That would be like lactose intolerance, where we lack the enzyme lactase to break down lactose, which is the sugar, gluten, caffeine, sulfites, fructose, amines, salicylates, and FODMAPs. FODMAPs are all different structures and types of sugars. This can usually be managed with the use of supplemental enzymes. So let's say we have low bile production and we're unable to properly digest fats, and this will be common for anyone who's had their gallbladder removed. Then we can take a supplemental enzyme or bile salts to help us digest those fats and usually reverse that problem. We also need to be aware that if we have an autoimmune disorder, we may be a lot more sensitive to environmental substances. Things like ingredients or chemicals in personal care products, like shampoo, lotion, our home cleaning products, our lawn care products, and then even medications, including vaccines, because a lot of the trigger ingredients that we see in like processed foods are the same ingredients that are being used as preservatives and emulsifiers and stabilizers in vaccines and medications. So we want to be aware that we might have sensitivities to those things as well. And the symptoms that we might see from that would be all of those food sensitivity symptoms but not the digestive ones. So we could still get headaches or skin problems, fatigue, mood swings, anxiety, joint pain, brain fog. All of that might signal that we have some type of an environmental sensitivity. So the healing protocol for autoimmune disorders really needs to include multiple components. We need to identify and remove the trigger foods. We need to heal the leaky gut. This will be helped somewhat by removing those trigger foods, which will reduce our inflammation. But there's also things we can do to make that more proactive. And if you're interested in that, go check out the gut health video. We have to manage stress. Stress directly causes inflammation and chronic health issues, and we have to, on a daily basis, identify with the things that typically stress us, try to manage them. We can't avoid them or eliminate them completely, but we need to be able to manage them. And we also need to identify and remove those environmental triggers. That's a little easier than the food triggers, because again, that food trigger could be something that is considered something healthy, like a healthy food, something that's good for you, where if on the environmental level, we simply try to clean things up and remove as many chemicals as we can, as many artificial ingredients and substances as we can, then we may not know exactly which one was causing it, but we can certainly remove those triggers. As far as the food triggers, there's different things we can do. All have pros and cons. So we can keep a food journal, jot down what we eat, when we ate it, and then what symptoms we had, and what time we had them. And over a few days, we will start to see patterns. And we can use that to identify what we think are going to be some of our food triggers. Food journals can be a pain, not exactly fun, but they're an inexpensive way to try to identify your food triggers without going and doing testing. So another thing we can do is the elimination diet, and there's different forms of this, but basically what they do is they remove the foods that are known to cause inflammation, things like gluten, dairy, artificial sweeteners, colors and dyes, flavors, could be corn, beef, pork, eggs, soy, those FODMAPs, which are sugars. There's a form of elimination diet called the AutoImmune protocol that also eliminates all grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, nightshades, tobacco, alcohol, coffee, all refined and processed sugars, and even certain medications. There's a lot of different styles and methods to use for anti-inflammatory diets. The important thing is you have to eliminate all these things for at least 28 days because that's how long it takes to remove the antibodies from your system. And once we do that, we don't know what our trigger food was, so you have that phase of where you have to add things back in, maybe one at a time, to figure out what your trigger is. Again, kind of a pain. It'll get you there, cheaper than testing, but an alternative that you can look at. Then testing can be done to look for specific foods or chemicals, usually those found in foods, but some of the tests do go outside to common environmental substances as well. And it's important to look at the type of test you're doing because they do different things. So if someone's giving you, saying that they're doing a food sensitivity test, but they're only testing for IgE, then they're actually testing for allergies, not sensitivities. So they can be looking at antibodies, and they can differentiate that between the IgE, the IgG, and they can figure out what foods you're sensitive to based on the specific antibodies. You can also do a skin prick test if you think it's just an allergy, not a sensitivity. Personal opinion here, again, those allergy reactions are typically really soon after you've consumed the food. So it's pretty easy to identify those foods that are causing you an allergic reaction. And the best thing to do is avoid them. For food sensitivities, that may be a food that we like and we want to include in our diet. So I would focus my money for testing, if I was going to spend it, on a sensitivity test, and then go through a healing protocol because you might be able to add some of those foods back into your diet later. And then the other type of test is called that mediator release test. And what it does is it measures those little chemical reactions rather than the presence of antibodies. And the reason this is beneficial is because, let's say you suspected you were sensitive to a certain food and you stopped eating it, and then you had that test like 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks after you stopped eating it, those antibodies are going to be either very low or gone. So it might not show up on an antibody test, but it would show up on a mediator release test. They are definitely usually more expensive than just your food sensitivity tests, but it might be worth it if that's something you want to look into. Then conventional medicine typically addresses autoimmune disorders with medications, and these medications are usually designed to target a specific immune process or type of immune cell or type of immune substance, which means that in general they are immune system suppressing. The reason this is a problem: autoimmune disorders have both a chronic and an acute component. That acute component is when we have a flare-up or reaction. That's what the medications are targeting. In general, though, they suppress your immune system overall, which means they're making the chronic component worse. So those medications are really only managing symptoms that are not really helping you heal. So you want to look at those other things like removing trigger foods, healing leaky gut, managing your stress, managing your environmental factors. Those are the things that are truly going to heal you for the autoimmune disorder. So to recap, right now we know there are over 80 different autoimmune disorders, and they affect probably around 25% of the population. There are multiple risk factors involved that include individual genetics and individual environmental factors. They involve an immune response where the body attacks its own cells and tissues, and those specific cells or tissues are going to vary depending on which the disorder we're looking at, usually accompanied by leaky gut. And our healing protocol really needs to include multiple components that identify those food triggers, identify the environmental factors, heal the leaky gut, and we manage our stress. Thank you. I hope that was informative and maybe helpful and helps you on your journey to optimal health. Have a great day.